Welcome to the Nonprofit Compliance Brief, where we explain charitable solicitation and multi-state fundraising requirements in clear, practical terms for nonprofit leaders and finance teams. This podcast is produced by Ironwood Registrations.
And today we are actually doing something just a little bit different for this deep dive.
Yeah, we really are. Usually on this show, we take a microscope to a really specific state statute or maybe a singular filing requirement. We zoom all the way into the fine print.
Right, we get really into the weeds.
Exactly. But today, we are zooming out. We've got this massive stack of research, some really fascinating case studies, and operational notes here in front of us regarding the organizational life cycle.
And we are looking at how compliance actually feels, and how it functions as a nonprofit grows up. We're calling this the maturity lens.
The maturity lens. I love that.
It's a great framing. And it's a crucial distinction to make right off the bat, I think, because when we talk about maturity in this deep dive, we aren't talking about age. We aren't, checking the date on your incorporation papers to see if you've been around for a decade or whatever.
Yeah, it's not about how many birthday candles are on the organization's cake.
Exactly. I mean, you can have a 30-year-old nonprofit that still manages compliance like a scrappy startup in a garage, just relying on sticky notes and hope.
Sticky notes and hope. That is a dangerous strategy.
It really is. And conversely, you can have a 3-year-old organization that operates with the total sophistication of a major institution. So maturity really isn't about time. It is about behavior. It's about systems.
And look into the source material here. The research really highlights a distinct transition point where an organization moves from what they call survival mode to strategy mode.
Yes. And I think everyone listening right now can probably identify with survival mode.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is that feeling of just trying to keep your head above water. Every day is a new fire.
Right. But let's unpack that contrast for you. If we looked at two organizations side by side, one in that frantic survival mode and one in a mature strategy mode, the fundamental difference in their day-to-day existence is actually pretty stark.
It's night and day. So what is the core contrast there?
Well, the core contrast is urgency versus predictability.
Okay, it's urgency versus predictability.
Yeah, in an early stage or a less mature compliance environment, everything is a fire drill. You are effectively governed by what arrives in the mailbox today.
Which is terrifying.
Right. You get a notice from California or maybe a renewal form from Pennsylvania that you totally forgot about, and suddenly everything else just stops.
The research calls that the urgency trap. You basically have to drop all your real work to put out this administrative fire.
Precisely. And it creates this stop-and-go workflow that completely kills productivity. You are reacting to the regulator rather than managing the process yourself.
You're on their schedule.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with a mature organization. They have replaced that reaction with anticipation. They don't wait for the mail.
Right. They already know what's coming.
They know that on May 15th, the renewal for New York is due. They know that in November, they need to prep for the big holiday fundraising pushes and their charitable registrations at the same time. The work happens on their schedule, not the state's schedule.
So in a weird way, the whole goal of organizational maturity is to make compliance boring.
Yes. That is actually the perfect way to put it. You really want compliance to be boring.
Yeah.
You want it to be totally routine.
So it's another Tuesday.
Right. If your compliance meetings are exciting or adrenaline-filled, something has probably gone very wrong. We are aiming for a predictable, steady rhythm.
Make compliance boring again. I really think we need to put that on a hat or a mug or something.
I'd buy one.
But let's dig into how that actually happens, because it's super easy for us to sit here and say, be predictable. But the research points to some very specific structural hurdles that prevent organizations from making that leap.
For sure.
And one of the biggest pain points I'm seeing in the notes here is this idea of ownership, like who actually holds the ball.
This is a huge hurdle. In the early days of an organization, you often see what the researchers call the all hats problem.
Right. Everyone wearing all the hats.
Exactly. Everyone is pitching in, which is great for the culture, that we are all in this together kind of vibe, but it is terrible for actual accountability.
Because if everyone is responsible, no one is responsible.
Precisely. You ask the team, hey, who handles state registrations? And the answer is usually something like, well, Sarah does the mail, but Jim signs the checks, and I think the intern filed the extension last year.
Right, it's a mess.
Yeah.
Or, perhaps even more dangerous, you have what the tech world calls the bus factor.
Oh, the bus factor is terrifying for compliance.
It really is. It's when you have one single person, maybe an overworked office manager or a super frantic founder, who basically holds the entire compliance history of the organization in their head.
Yeah, they know all the passwords, they know the specific deadlines, they know where the physical files are buried.
And if that person gets hit by a bus, or, less morbidly, they win the lottery and move to Fiji, the organization is in massive trouble.
Massive trouble. Because that institutional knowledge just walks right out the front door with them.
So how does a mature organization fix that?
Well, mature organizations recognize that single point of failure as a critical operational risk. So they shift from individual knowledge to institutional knowledge. They document roles very specifically.
So it's not just, hey, Sarah handles it.
Right, no. It is a documented process. It says the development director provides the fundraising data by the first of the month. The finance director provides the Form 990. The operations manager physically files the renewal.
Got it. So it becomes a relay race, not a solo sprint. You need to know exactly who you are handing the baton to.
Exactly. And critically, they ensure continuity. So if a staff member does move to Fiji, the system remains. The deadlines are still on the shared calendar. The passwords are in a secure vault. And the history of what was filed is totally accessible to the next person who steps into that role.
And that segues perfectly into the tools of the trade. You just mentioned the calendar. I feel like in the survival mode phase, the system is basically just a collection of sticky notes around a monitor. Or maybe a frantic Outlook reminder set for the day before a deadline.
Sticky notes are the absolute enemy of compliance maturity.
They really are.
I mean, if your legal standing in a state relies on a piece of yellow paper not losing its stickiness and falling off a monitor, you are in a very high-risk zone.
Noted. Throwing away my sticky notes immediately. So what does the mature stack look like then? We aren't talking about office supplies anymore.
No, the shift is strongly toward centralization. Mature nonprofits stop relying on scattered reminders and they build a centralized hub.
What does that hub include?
Usually, this involves a consolidated compliance calendar where you can view the entire year all at once. You aren't just seeing what is due this week. You can actually see the crunch time coming 3 months from now.
It creates visibility for the whole team. And I imagine this applies to file storage too, right? Because I have heard horror stories of audits where the team is scrambling to find an approval letter from 3 years ago, and nobody knows if it's in a Dropbox folder or a physical filing cabinet in the basement or trapped in an old email chain.
That is the treasure hunt method of compliance, and it wastes countless hours of productivity.
Treasure hunt method.
Yeah. A mature system has standardized documentation storage. There is a specific known place for state registrations, and it's organized logically by year and state. It sounds incredibly basic, like just file your papers. But you would be totally shocked at how many organizations lose significant time just hunting for basic files.
It seems like the true litmus test for maturity here is, can a stranger navigate your system?
That is exactly the test. If a temp worker came into your office tomorrow, could they find the approval letter from Tennessee for 2024 within 30 seconds?
Wow, 40 seconds.
Yeah. If the answer is no, you have work to do on your maturity model. Centralization reduces the reliance on human memory. You don't have to remember where you put a document. You just have to know the system.
Okay, let's pivot and talk about the ecosystem. We talked about ownership and tools, but let's talk about how the different teams actually work together. Because often, compliance feels like this totally lonely administrative task happening in a dark corner while the rest of the organization is out there saving the world.
That silo mentality is incredibly common in early stage groups. You hear things like, compliance is the finance team's problem, or that's just legal's headache.
Right.
But in a mature ecosystem, compliance is a team sport. It requires real alignment between departments. You have finance, development, and leadership, all playing a crucial role.
Can you give us an example of how that coordination works in practice? I am particularly interested in the relationship between development, the fundraisers, and compliance, because those two seem like they might butt heads pretty often.
Oh, they absolutely can butt heads. Think about a standard fundraising campaign. The development team decides, hey, we want to launch a massive direct mail campaign to donors in Florida next week.
Okay.
In a survival mode organization, they just send the mail. They are laser focused on revenue and getting the word out. Then, 3 months later, the compliance person gets a nasty letter from the state of Florida saying, you solicited here without registering.
And now you are facing fines, you have to pay back fees, and you look completely unprofessional to the regulator.
Exactly. But in a mature organization, that conversation happens before the letters ever go out the door.
Proactive communication.
Right. Development says, here's our strategy for the quarter. Compliance looks at it and says, okay, we aren't registered in Florida yet. We need 30 days to get that process before you hit send. And finance chimes in and says, here is the budget for those state fees.
I love that. It creates true operational integration. Compliance stops being the Department of No and becomes the Department of How.
That is a beautiful way to put it. It enables the fundraising strategy rather than just blocking it at the last minute. And speaking of finance, let's talk about the money side of this. The research outline mentions proactive financial planning. How is that different from just, doing your taxes every year?
Well, according to the sources, it is really about eliminating surprises. Early-stage organizations often get totally blindsided by financial reporting requirements.
What kind of requirements?
For example, many states require a full independent audit once your contributions hit a certain threshold. Say $500,000 or $1 million, depending on the state you're in.
Right. And full audits are expensive. And they are incredibly time-consuming for the staff. You definitely do not want to find out you need one 2 weeks before a state deadline.
Precisely. That is the audit trap. Let's say you are based in a state with low regulation, but you have a really great year online, the video goes viral, and you raise $750,000 from donors all across the country.
Which is great news for the mission.
It's fantastic news.
Right.
But suddenly you trigger the audit requirement in states like California or Pennsylvania because you crossed their specific thresholds. A mature organization anticipates this. They actively monitor their revenue projections throughout the entire year.
So they see the train coming down the tracks from miles away.
Yes. If they see they're going to cross that audit threshold, they start coordinating with their accounting team months in advance. They budget for the audit cost, which, let's be real, can easily be $15,000 or $20,000.
Easily.
And they set very clear timelines for document preparation.
So transparency just becomes a built-in expectation.
Yes. They aren't scrambling to find receipts in shoeboxes. They have been preparing for the exam all semester, so to speak.
I like that analogy.
And it changes the relationship with the board of directors, too. Instead of coming to the board in a total panic, asking for emergency funds for an unexpected audit, you present a budget at the start of the year that includes it as a planned cost of growth. It looks professional. It builds real trust.
I want to touch on something that I think gets overlooked a lot in these conversations, which is the story or the narrative of the nonprofit. We usually think of compliance as just numbers on forms, but there is a major public-facing aspect to this, right? The research calls this the single source of truth.
Absolutely. This is where organizational consistency becomes absolutely vital. A mature nonprofit ensures that the story they tell is consistent across all of their channels.
What do we mean by channels here, specifically?
Well, we mean your IRS Form 990, your state charitable registrations, your public website, your donor brochures, and your internal governance records.
Okay, that's a lot of different places.
It is. And here's where it gets tricky for growing organizations. Sometimes the marketing team will write a beautiful, highly emotional description of a program for the website, and they claim it is the organization's primary focus to drive donations.
Right, they're doing their job trying to raise money.
Exactly. But then the accountant describes that exact same program completely differently, or maybe minimizes the expense allocation on the Form 990 because of how they categorize things.
And that discrepancy raises a red flag.
It absolutely can.
Huh.
Regulators and even savvy donors or watchdog groups like Charity Navigator, they look for those discrepancies. If the 990 says you only spend $10,000 on a program, but your website claims it is your primary focus, that just doesn't add up.
It looks misleading, even if it's just an administrative disconnect.
Right. Mature organizations ensure total alignment there. They make sure the mission statement on the state registration form matches the bylaws, which matches the website, which matches the 990.
It sounds like this is all just deeply tied to growth. You cannot run a $10 million organization with the same infrastructure you used when you were a $100,000 organization. It just breaks under the pressure.
It absolutely breaks. And this brings us to a really key theme of this deep dive that was prominent in the source material. We have this note here that I want to highlight, and I think every single listener needs to hear this.
Let's hear it.
Compliance tends to expand alongside fundraising growth, and organizations that review requirements periodically avoid most problems.
That really feels like the law of gravity for nonprofits. The more you succeed in fundraising, the more compliance weight you have to carry. There's no escaping it.
It is a completely linear relationship. But survival mode organizations often try to ignore that reality. They aggressively grow the fundraising arm, but they totally starve the administrative arm.
So, unlike a startup that might only look at compliance when a deadline is staring them in the face, established organizations are doing what? Just checking in on themselves.
Exactly. They conduct periodic reviews. Think of it like a routine health checkup. They don't wait until they are sick to go to the doctor.
Right.
Maybe once a year or even quarterly, leadership sits down and asks some basic questions. Where are we soliciting now? Have we entered new states? Have our bylaws changed? Are there new laws we need to be aware of?
It's just proactive maintenance.
It is. And this is also where specialization comes into play. As you grow, you might realize that keeping everything in-house just doesn't make sense anymore.
Sure.
In a small shop, the executive director might be the one filing the state reports. As you mature, that is a terrible use of the executive director's time.
Oh, absolutely. Their time is worth way more in major donor meetings or directing program strategy.
Exactly. So what do? You mean outsourcing?
Sometimes, yes. Or just specializing your internal roles. You might hire a dedicated compliance officer, or you might partner with a third-party service to handle the multi-state registrations. It becomes part of your professional infrastructure. You are essentially paying for reliability and continuity.
It is really interesting how this shifts the whole vibe of the organization. We talked earlier about the stress of the early days, those hair-on-fire days. But when you finally have these systems in place, the calendar, the role clarity, the periodic reviews, does the culture actually change inside the office?
It changes completely. It goes from being viewed as a burden to being viewed as stewardship.
Stewardship. I really like that word. It sounds much more noble than just paperwork.
It is, because in a mature nonprofit, compliance isn't seen as the government just trying to hassle you. It's seen as a vital way to protect the organization and protect the mission. It is about maintaining the public trust. Leadership values the predictability of the systems because it protects the board members and it protects the brand reputation.
So the staff understands what is expected of them,
Yeah.
and it just becomes part of the DNA.
Exactly. It is embedded, not imposed. It's just how we do things here. And that psychological shift for a team is huge. It removes the fear factor entirely. You aren't worried about opening the mail anymore.
This has been such a fascinating look at the evolution of an organization. It is really not just about filling out forms. It is about building a machine that can sustain your mission for the long haul.
That is the ultimate goal. You want a platform that is stable enough to support the full weight of your ambition.
So as we wrap up this deep dive today, let's just quickly summarize the roadmap we've laid out from the research. We are moving from reactive waiting for the mail to proactive. We are moving from the all hats problem to clearly defined ownership and institutional memory. We are moving from sticky notes to centralized systems. And critically, we are reviewing our growth periodically so we don't outgrow our own infrastructure.
You nailed it. And
Yeah.
I think it's important to remind our listeners one last time, mature nonprofits don't necessarily have fewer requirements. In fact, they usually have more because they are fundraising in more places. They just manage them differently.
They manage the complexity rather than letting the complexity manage them.
Right. And here is the provocative thought I really want to leave everyone with today. It is a bit of a challenge to our listeners who might feel stuck in that survival mode right now.
Go for it.
When you transform compliance from a source of stress into a stable foundation, you aren't just following rules, you are building a platform. So ask yourself this: how much faster could you grow if you weren't constantly looking over your shoulder?
That is a very powerful question. It is hard to run fast when you are constantly worried you're going to trip over a regulatory wire.
Exactly. Clear the path, and you can run much faster.
If you found this discussion helpful, you can find additional compliance guides and visual resources at ironwoodregistrations.com. Thanks for listening.